The heavy wooden doors of St. Michael's Episcopal Church in Little Rock, Arkansas, creaked open on that crisp October morning. But it wasn't a late parishioner who entered. Instead, a large gray pit bull appeared in the doorway, his scarred body illuminated by the morning light streaming through the stained glass windows. The congregation fell into stunned silence as the dog's nails clicked against the wooden floor. Father James Morrison paused mid-prayer, his weathered hands still holding the Bible. Something extraordinary was about to unfold within these sacred walls. The church had stood as a beacon of hope in the community for over a century, its stone walls witnessing countless prayers, weddings, and moments of divine intervention. That morning, the pews were filled with the usual faces: Mrs. Thompson, the elderly choir director with arthritic hands and an unwavering faith; Sarah Martinez, a young single mother struggling to make ends meet; and Marcus Jenkins, a recovered addict who had found salvation within these walls. The morning light painted rainbow patterns across the worn wooden floors, unaware that today's service would be anything but ordinary. The pit bull's ribs showed through his dirty gray coat, each visible bone telling a story of hardship and survival on the unforgiving streets. Yet despite his intimidating size and battle-worn appearance, his eyes held a gentleness that seemed almost human. He carried himself with quiet dignity, as if he understood the sanctity of the space he had entered. His presence commanded attention not through fear, but through an inexplicable aura of purpose. Time seemed to slow as the dog made his way down the center aisle, passing row after row of stunned parishioners. Mrs. Thompson clutched her hymnal tighter, her knuckles turning white with apprehension. Young Tommy Wilson's eyes widened with wonder, while his mother instinctively pulled him closer. The usual sounds of shuffling feet and whispered prayers had given way to complete silence, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of the dog's nails. Father Morrison remained still at the altar, watching as the unexpected visitor approached. In his 30 years of ministry, he had learned to see God's hand in unexpected places, but even he was taken aback by this unusual interruption. The morning sunlight caught the dog's face through the stained glass, highlighting scars that spoke of countless battles and hardships. Something in the animal's determined yet peaceful demeanor stirred something deep within the priest's soul. Sarah Martinez felt tears welling up in her eyes as she watched the scene unfold, though she couldn't explain why. Her 5-year-old daughter Emily sat beside her, unusually quiet and still. Something about the dog's dignified persistence, despite obvious hardship, struck a chord within Sarah's heart. Her own daily struggles as a single mother seemed reflected in the animal's battle-worn appearance. She found herself holding her breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The tension in the church was palpable as the pit bull continued his steady advance toward the altar. Some parishioners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned forward, drawn by an inexplicable sense that they were witnessing something profound. The usual Sunday morning routines and ceremonies suddenly felt secondary to this moment. Every eye in the congregation followed the dog's deliberate progress, each person lost in their own thoughts and interpretations of this unexpected event. Marcus Jenkins, sitting in his usual spot near the back, felt a strong connection to the animal before him. As someone who had known life on the streets, he recognized the look of a soul seeking sanctuary. The dog's scars told stories that resonated with his own past struggles and journey to redemption. His hands, once shaky from withdrawal but now steady with recovery, gripped the pew in front of him as he watched the scene unfold. The pit bull's presence had created an almost electric atmosphere in the church. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed to follow him, creating an ethereal glow around his form. Despite his size and intimidating breed, there was nothing threatening about his demeanor. Instead, he moved with a grace that seemed almost supernatural, as if guided by an unseen force. Each step appeared deliberate and meaningful, building anticipation throughout the congregation. Mrs. Thompson, despite her initial fear, found herself reaching out toward the dog as he passed her pew. Her arthritis-curved fingers trembled in the air, sensing a kindred spirit in this broken but dignified being. The pit bull paused briefly, acknowledging her gesture with a gentle tilt of his head. In that moment, her fear melted away, replaced by a warmth she couldn't explain. The dog's eyes met hers briefly, and she saw in them a depth of understanding that took her breath away. The usual sounds of the Sunday service, the rustling of hymnal pages, the creaking of wooden pews, the soft murmur of prayers, had all ceased. The only sounds were the dog's steady breathing and the distant toll of church bells carried on the autumn wind. Time seemed to stand still within the sacred space, as if the very air was holding its breath in anticipation. Even the youngest children in the congregation remained perfectly still, captivated by the unfolding scene. Outside, the world continued its Sunday morning routine, unaware of the extraordinary events taking place within St. Michael's walls. Cars passed by on the street, their sounds muffled by the thick stone walls. The autumn wind rustled through the trees, sending leaves dancing across the church steps. But inside, a profound transformation was beginning to take place. The congregation watched, hearts beating in collective anticipation, as the Pitbull approached the final steps leading to the altar. As the dog reached the front of the church, the morning light suddenly intensified, streaming through the large stained glass window behind the altar. The rays caught his fur, transforming his dirty gray coat into a tapestry of colored light. Father Morrison stood motionless, his prayer book forgotten in his hands, the Pitbull's eyes fixed upon him with an intensity that seemed to pierce his very soul. In that moment, everyone present felt the weight of something greater than themselves descending upon the church. The tension reached its peak as the Pitbull finally stopped at the foot of the altar. His journey down the aisle had seemed to last both an eternity and mere seconds. The entire congregation held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Father Morrison looked down at the dog, their eyes meeting in a moment of silent communion. The sunlight continued to play across the scene, creating an almost supernatural atmosphere. Something extraordinary was about to happen, and every person present could feel it in their bones. As the Pitbull stood before the altar, Father Morrison noticed something that made his heart ache. A deep, poorly healed wound on the dog's side, still seeping and clearly infected. The injury spoke of recent trauma, possibly from a fight or accident, and it was clear the animal was in tremendous pain. Despite his obvious suffering, the dog's eyes remained focused and determined, fixed upon the golden cross that hung above the altar. The morning light caught the wound, making it appear even more severe than it was. Sarah Martinez's young daughter Emily began to cry softly in her mother's arms, her small body shaking with quiet sobs. The child's empathy for the injured animal touched something deep within the congregation, and soon there wasn't a dry eye in the church. Several people reached for tissues, moved by the sight of the wounded creature seeking sanctuary in their midst. The atmosphere grew heavy with shared emotion as the reality of the dog's condition became apparent to everyone present. The Pitbull suddenly swayed on his feet, his strength finally beginning to fail after what must have been an extraordinary journey to reach this place. His legs trembled with exhaustion, and his breathing became more labored. A small pool of blood began to form beneath him on the pristine altar steps. Several gasps echoed through the church as people realized just how dire the situation was. The dog's determination to reach this specific place, despite his injuries, seemed to carry an almost supernatural significance. Marcus Jenkins was the first to break the spell of inaction, rising from his pew with purpose. As someone who had known rock bottom, he recognized a soul in desperate need of help. His movement seemed to awaken others from their stunned silence. Mrs. Thompson began digging through her purse for her phone to call the veterinarian. The entire congregation stirred with a growing sense of urgency and purpose. Father Morrison carefully set down his prayer book and slowly approached the injured animal, his movements gentle and deliberate. The dog watched him approach, maintaining eye contact but showing no sign of fear or aggression. The priest had seen many lost souls seek refuge in his church over the years, but something about this creature's quiet dignity touched him deeply. As he drew closer, he could see the extent of the dog's injuries, not just the fresh wound, but old scars that told a story of long-term abuse. The Pitbull's legs finally gave out, and he collapsed gracefully onto the altar steps, still maintaining his dignified bearing despite his weakness. Emily's cries grew louder, echoing through the church as the child buried her face in her mother's shoulder. Sarah held her daughter tightly, her own tears falling freely now. The congregation watched in collective anguish as the proud animal's strength ebbed away. Father Morrison knelt beside the dog, unmindful of the blood now staining his pristine white robes. Tommy Wilson's father, Dr. James Wilson, a local veterinarian who had been sitting quietly in the back of the church, quickly made his way forward. His professional demeanor couldn't quite mask his concern as he assessed the dog's condition. The wound was severe, showing signs of infection that had likely been festering for days. The dog's elevated temperature and shallow breathing indicated a serious systemic infection. Time was clearly of the essence. Mrs. Thompson had begun organizing the other parishioners, her years of choir direction experience naturally leading her to take charge of the situation. Some were sent to fetch clean towels from the church kitchen, while others were dispatched to their cars for first aid kits. The usual order of the Sunday service was completely forgotten as the congregation united in their desire to help. The elderly woman's voice, usually used for directing hymns, now rang out with clear, purposeful instructions. The Pitbull's eyes never left the cross above the altar, even as Dr. Wilson began his examination. There was something almost mystical about the dog's unwavering gaze, as if he had been drawn to this specific place for a reason beyond human understanding. The morning light streaming through the stained glass windows seemed to intensify, creating a halo effect around the injured animal. The scene took on an almost biblical quality, reminiscent of ancient tales of divine intervention. Sarah Martinez found herself moving forward, drawn by an inexplicable force. As she approached, she recognized something in the dog's eyes that mirrored her own journey, the look of someone who had faced countless hardships but refused to give up. Emily followed her mother, her small hand clutching Sarah's skirt. The child's tears had stopped, replaced by a solemn determination to help. Together, they knelt beside the dog, Emily's tiny hand reaching out to gently stroke his head. The dog's breathing had become more labored, each breath a visible struggle. Dr. Wilson's expression grew increasingly concerned as he continued his examination. The infection had spread further than initially thought, and the dog's temperature was dangerously high. The veterinarian knew that without immediate intervention, the prognosis was grim. Yet something about this situation felt different from his usual emergency cases. There was a palpable sense of purpose in the air. Father Morrison began to pray softly, his hand resting gently on the Pitbull's head. The dog leaned slightly into his touch, as if drawing comfort from the priest's presence. The morning light caught the tears in Father Morrison's eyes, creating tiny rainbows that seemed to dance in the air. The entire congregation fell silent, many bowing their heads in shared prayer. The usual Sunday service had transformed into something far more profound, a moment of collective compassion and faith. Marcus Jenkins had returned with his truck keys in hand, ready to transport the dog to the veterinary clinic. His own journey of redemption had taught him the importance of acting quickly when divine intervention presented itself. Dr. Wilson nodded gratefully, already planning the emergency treatment the dog would need. The atmosphere in the church had shifted from shock and sadness to purposeful determination. Every person present understood that they were part of something extraordinary. As they prepared to move the injured animal, the Pitbull made one final effort to rise, his eyes still fixed on the cross above. Despite his weakened state, there was an undeniable strength in his bearing that touched everyone present. The morning light seemed to pulse briefly, illuminating the scene in an almost supernatural glow. Father Morrison's prayers grew stronger, joined now by the voices of the entire congregation. What had begun as an ordinary Sunday service had become a powerful testament to faith, compassion, and the mysterious ways in which divine providence works through the most unexpected messengers. What happened next would be remembered by the congregation of St. Michael's for years to come. As Marcus Jenkins and Dr. Wilson prepared to move the injured Pitbull, little Emily Martinez broke free from her mother's grasp and rushed forward. The small girl, usually shy and reserved, knelt beside the dog with tears streaming down her face. She placed her tiny hand on the Pitbull's head and began to sing the hymn she had learned in Sunday school, Amazing Grace. Her clear, pure voice rang through the church. The effect was immediate and extraordinary. The Pitbull's labored breathing seemed to ease slightly, and his eyes, though still fixed on the cross, softened. Other voices began to join Emily's, starting with Mrs. Thompson and spreading through the congregation until the entire church resounded with the beloved hymn. The morning light, streaming through the stained glass windows, appeared to pulse in rhythm with the music. The atmosphere in the church shifted from desperate concern to something more powerful: hope. Dr. Wilson, who had been preparing a makeshift stretcher, noticed something remarkable. The infection around the dog's wound, which had been angry and red moments before, began to show signs of improvement. The veterinarian had seen countless cases of infection throughout his career, but never had he witnessed anything like this. The change was subtle but undeniable, defying medical explanation. He caught Father Morrison's eye, and the two men shared a look of wonder. Sarah Martinez watched her daughter with amazement, tears streaming down her face. For months, Emily had barely spoken since their escape from an abusive home, her trauma manifesting in near-complete silence. Yet here she was, singing her heart out to a wounded stray dog. The mother's hands trembled as she observed this miracle within a miracle. Something profound was happening in this sacred space, touching not only the injured animal but everyone present. The Pitbull's eyes finally moved from the cross to meet Emily's gaze. In that moment, a connection formed between the wounded animal and the traumatized child that transcended ordinary understanding. Both had known pain, both had survived, and both were finding healing in this unexpected encounter. The dog's tail, despite his weakness, managed a small thump against the altar steps. Emily's song grew stronger, her voice carrying all the emotion she had been unable to express for so long. Father Morrison, still kneeling beside the dog, felt the presence of something greater than himself in that moment. In 30 years of ministry, he had witnessed many powerful moments of faith, but this was different. The convergence of circumstances, the injured dog's deliberate journey to the church, Emily's sudden breakthrough, the inexplicable physical changes spoke of divine intervention. His prayers took on a new intensity as he watched the scene unfold. Mrs. Thompson, who had been organizing the rescue effort, suddenly noticed something extraordinary about the light in the church. The usual rainbow patterns from the stained glass had transformed, seeming to concentrate around the small group at the altar. The colors appeared more vibrant than she had ever seen in her 40 years of service. Golden light bathed the scene, reminiscent of Renaissance paintings of divine visitation. The elderly woman found herself transfixed by the supernatural quality of the moment. Marcus Jenkins, who had been ready to carry the dog to his truck, stood frozen in place. As a recovered addict, he had experienced his own miracle of transformation within these walls, but witnessing this was something else entirely. The atmosphere in the church had become charged with an almost electric energy. The hymn continued to build, voices joining in perfect harmony as if guided by an unseen conductor. The sound filled every corner of the sacred space. Dr. Wilson observed with growing amazement as the dog's vital signs began to stabilize. The Pitbull's fever, which had been dangerously high, was noticeably decreasing. The wound itself seemed to be responding to some unseen force, the angry inflammation visibly receding. While his scientific mind searched for explanations, his heart told him he was witnessing something beyond medical understanding. He had treated countless animals throughout his career, but never had he seen anything quite like this. The congregation's song reached a crescendo, their voices unified in a way Mrs. Thompson had never achieved in all her years of choir direction. The sound seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the church, creating harmonics that shouldn't have been possible in the old building's acoustics. The stained glass windows appeared to shimmer in response, casting ever-changing patterns of light across the scene. The atmosphere was thick with an almost tangible sense of the divine. Emily, still singing, had begun to gently stroke the Pitbull's head. Her small fingers traced the old scars on his face with a tenderness that brought fresh tears to her mother's eyes. The dog leaned into her touch, his eyes half closed in what appeared to be peaceful contentment. The child's own trauma seemed to be healing alongside the dog's physical wounds. Sarah watched in wonder as her daughter's face displayed emotions she hadn't seen since before their escape from abuse. The transformation in the dog's condition continued to progress before their eyes. His breathing had steadied, becoming deeper and more regular. The wound, which had been seeping and infected, now appeared to be several days into the healing process. Dr. Wilson made careful notes of everything he observed, knowing that what he was witnessing defied medical explanation. The veterinarian's hands trembled slightly as he documented this extraordinary case. As the hymn gradually came to an end, the atmosphere in the church remained charged with energy. The morning light, which had seemed to dance and pulse during the song, settled into a warm, steady glow. The Pitbull's eyes moved from Emily to scan the gathered congregation, as if acknowledging each person who had joined in the prayer for his healing. His gaze carried a wisdom and gratitude that seemed far beyond ordinary animal consciousness. Father Morrison rose slowly to his feet, his white robes still stained with the dog's blood, yet somehow the stains seemed to form a pattern that looked almost like a cross. The priest's voice, when he finally spoke, carried a quiet awe that resonated through the hushed church. "My friends," he began, "we have witnessed something extraordinary today." The congregation remained silent, each person understanding that they had been part of something miraculous. The Pitbull's tail thumped gently against the floor, creating a quiet rhythm that seemed to echo the beating of their collective hearts. In the days that followed the miraculous Sunday service, the story of the Pitbull's divine intervention spread throughout Little Rock. Dr. Wilson had taken the dog to his clinic for proper medical care, though the inexplicable healing that had begun in the church continued to progress. The wound that had been life-threatening now healed at an unprecedented rate. Medical colleagues from across the state came to witness the extraordinary case, leaving baffled by what they saw. The dog's recovery defied all conventional medical understanding. Emily Martinez visited the clinic every day after school, her mother watching with joy as her daughter's voice and personality continued to emerge from the shadows of trauma. The Pitbull, whom Emily had named Grace, responded to the child's presence with undeniable recognition and affection. Their bond deepened with each visit, two wounded souls helping each other heal. The staff at the clinic noticed that Grace's vital signs would improve noticeably whenever Emily was present. Father Morrison made regular visits to the clinic as well, often finding Emily already there, reading stories to Grace from her children's Bible. The priest observed with wonder how the dog listened attentively to every word, his intelligent eyes following the child's movements. The blood stains on Father Morrison's robes had indeed formed a perfect cross pattern, and the garment now hung in a special display case in the church, a testament to the miracle they had witnessed. Sarah Martinez watched her daughter's transformation with grateful tears. Emily, who had barely spoken for months, now chattered constantly about Grace and their daily adventures. The trauma counselor reported remarkable progress in the child's healing process, attributing it to the unique bond she had formed with the dog. Sarah began to see divine purpose in their path to Little Rock and finding St. Michael's Church. Their escape from abuse had led them exactly where they needed to be. Mrs. Thompson organized a special fundraising effort among the congregation to cover Grace's medical expenses, though Dr. Wilson had already insisted on providing care free of charge. The money raised instead went toward establishing a fund for treating injured strays, ensuring that other animals would benefit from the miracle that had touched their church. The elderly choir director spoke often of how the hymn that day had transcended anything she had heard in her 40 years of music ministry. Marcus Jenkins took particular interest in Grace's case, visiting often and helping with the dog's physical therapy. His own experience with redemption and second chances gave him a unique perspective on the miracle they had witnessed. He spoke at local recovery meetings about the experience, using Grace's story as a powerful metaphor for healing and divine intervention. His testimony touched many hearts and inspired others to seek their own paths to redemption. The local media eventually caught wind of the story, though Father Morrison was careful to manage their interest with appropriate discretion. He understood that what had happened that Sunday morning went beyond simple human explanation. Reporters were moved by Emily's obvious transformation and Grace's remarkable recovery. But the priest knew that the true depth of the miracle could only be fully understood by those who had been present. The story aired on local news stations, inspiring viewers with its message of hope and healing. Dr. Wilson documented Grace's recovery meticulously, though he knew his medical reports could never fully capture the extraordinary nature of the case. The dog's wound healed completely within weeks, leaving barely a scar where the life-threatening injury had been. More remarkable was the change in Grace's eyes. The wariness and pain of his past had been replaced by a gentle wisdom that touched everyone who met him. The veterinarian found himself reevaluating his understanding of the relationship between faith and science. The congregation of St. Michael's was profoundly changed by the experience. Attendance at services grew as word spread, but more importantly, the church became known as a place of genuine healing and compassion. The Sunday school children created a special corner in their classroom dedicated to Grace, filling it with artwork depicting the miraculous day. Emily's picture of Grace standing before the altar became the centerpiece of the display. Grace's presence at the clinic had an unexpected effect on other animals under Dr. Wilson's care. The Pitbull showed remarkable empathy towards sick or injured patients, often sitting quietly beside anxious animals and somehow calming them. The staff began calling him the therapy dog, though they knew this title barely scratched the surface of his gift. Other veterinarians reported that their patients recovered more quickly on days when Grace visited their wards. Sarah and Emily ultimately made the decision to adopt Grace, though in truth, it felt more like fulfilling a divine appointment than making a choice. The dog who had stumbled into their church, broken and bleeding, had become an integral part of their healing journey. Their small apartment felt complete with Grace's presence, and Emily's nightmares about their past life finally began to fade. The dog slept faithfully beside her bed each night, a gentle guardian against the darkness. The transformation extended beyond the immediate participants in the miracle. Other churches in the area began opening their doors to animal blessing services, and local shelters reported increased adoption rates, particularly for pit bulls and other traditionally overlooked breeds. Grace's story had touched something deep in the community's consciousness, reminding people of the extraordinary ways in which divine love could manifest. The ripple effects of that miraculous Sunday continued to spread. As spring arrived, Grace became a regular presence at St. Michael's, accompanying Emily and Sarah to every service. He would lie quietly at Emily's feet during prayers, though his eyes still often turned toward the cross above the altar. The congregation had come to see him as a living testament to the power of faith and the reality of divine intervention. Children would often stop to pet him after services, drawn to his gentle nature and the peace that seemed to emanate from him. Father Morrison incorporated the story of Grace's miracle into his Easter sermon that year, speaking of resurrection and renewal in both the physical and spiritual sense. The congregation listened with deep understanding, many wiping away tears as they remembered that extraordinary Sunday. Grace sat in his usual spot beside Emily, his presence a powerful reminder that divine love could break through in unexpected ways, bringing healing and transformation to all it touched. The morning light through the stained glass windows still seemed to shine with special radiance whenever it fell upon the remarkable dog who had chosen their church as his sanctuary. 1 year after Grace first walked into St. Michael's Episcopal Church, the congregation gathered for a special anniversary service. The once wounded Pitbull now sat proudly beside Emily, his gray coat gleaming with health and his eyes bright with intelligence. Father Morrison stood at the altar, the morning light streaming through the stained glass windows, just as it had on that miraculous day. The church was filled to capacity, with people standing in the aisles and doorways. Everyone present felt the weight of the moment. Emily, no longer the silent, traumatized child she had been, stood confidently before the congregation to share her story. Her voice, clear and strong, carried through the church as she described how Grace had helped her find her own voice again. The Pitbull watched her attentively, his tail gently thumping against the floor in rhythm with her words. Sarah sat in the front pew, tears of joy streaming down her face as she witnessed her daughter's complete transformation. Mrs. Thompson had composed a special hymn for the occasion, titled "Amazing Grace, the Pitbull's Prayer." The choir's voices soared through the church, telling the story of a wounded soul finding healing in a house of God. Grace lifted his head as the music began, just as he had done that first day. The congregation watched in wonder as the dog seemed to sway gently with the melody. The morning light danced through the windows, creating those same mysterious patterns they had witnessed a year ago. Dr. Wilson presented his medical documentation of Grace's miraculous recovery, though he admitted that science alone could never fully explain what had happened. The wound that should have been fatal had healed without even leaving a significant scar. The veterinarian spoke of how this experience had transformed his own understanding of faith and healing. His voice trembled with emotion as he described the countless other animals who had been helped through Grace's extraordinary empathy and presence. Marcus Jenkins shared how Grace's story had become a powerful testimony in his work with recovery groups. The Pitbull's journey from near death to healing had resonated deeply with those struggling to rebuild their lives. Many in recovery had come to visit Grace at the clinic during their darkest moments, finding strength in the dog's gentle presence. The former addict spoke of how divine intervention could take many forms, even appearing as a wounded pit bull seeking sanctuary. Father Morrison reflected on how the miracle had transformed not just individual lives, but the entire community. The church's doors were now open daily for prayer and meditation, with Grace often present as an unofficial greeter. Local animal shelters reported that pit bull adoption rates had soared as people remembered the gentle soul who had walked into St. Michael's that Sunday morning. The priest spoke of how God's love could manifest in the most unexpected ways, breaking down prejudices and healing ancient fears. The story had spread far beyond Little Rock, touching hearts across the country. Other churches had begun their own animal blessing services, and several had started programs to help injured strays. Grace's miracle had sparked a movement of compassion that continued to grow. Photos of the blood-stained robes with their mysterious cross pattern had been shared worldwide, reminding people that divine intervention could still occur in modern times. The impact of that single Sunday morning continued to ripple outward. Sarah Martinez spoke next, describing how Grace had become an integral part of their family's healing journey. The dog slept beside Emily's bed each night, his presence keeping her daughter's nightmares at bay. Their small apartment had become a haven of peace and safety, filled with the love of their extraordinary guardian angel in canine form. The mother's voice filled with emotion as she described how Grace had helped them both learn to trust and love again. Emily had blossomed in school, her teachers amazed by her transformation. She had written an award-winning essay about Grace for a national competition, telling their story through the eyes of a child who had found her voice through love. The little girl who had once been too traumatized to speak now stood confidently before audiences, advocating for animal rescue and sharing her message of hope. Grace accompanied her to every speaking engagement, a living testament to the power of divine love. The medical community had been unable to explain Grace's extraordinary healing abilities with other animals. The pit bull seemed to know instinctively which patients needed him most, often sitting quietly beside those facing difficult recoveries. Dr. Wilson had documented countless cases where Grace's presence appeared to accelerate healing. The dog's gentle wisdom touched everyone he encountered, reminding them that some things in life transcended scientific explanation. Mrs. Thompson, now in her 80s, spoke of how the miracle had renewed her own faith. The hymn that had spontaneously united the congregation that day had been unlike anything she had experienced in her long career. She described how the music had seemed to come from somewhere beyond themselves, carrying a power that still gave her goosebumps to remember. The elderly choir director's eyes filled with tears as she recalled the moment when everything changed. The anniversary service concluded with the same hymn that Emily had begun singing that first day, Amazing Grace. As the congregation's voices filled the church, Grace stood and walked slowly to the altar, just as he had done 1 year ago. This time, however, he moved with strength and grace, his head held high. The morning light caught his fur, creating that same ethereal glow they remembered. Emily's voice rose clear and strong above the others, joining with her faithful companion in a duet of gratitude. Father Morrison offered a final prayer, speaking of how Grace's story had reminded them all of the extraordinary ways in which divine love could manifest in the world. The Pitbull sat beside him at the altar, his intelligent eyes scanning the congregation as if in blessing. The priest's words echoed through the hushed church, speaking of how sometimes the most profound miracles came in unexpected forms. Grace's tail thumped gently against the altar steps, keeping time with the prayer. The light through the stained glass windows seemed to intensify as the service drew to a close, bathing the church in a rainbow of colors. Grace and Emily stood together at the altar, their silhouettes merged in the brilliant light. The congregation sat in reverent silence, understanding that they were not just celebrating a past miracle, but witnessing its continuing power. In this moment, they knew with certainty that divine love could transform even the deepest wounds into instruments of healing, and that sometimes God's most powerful messengers came on 4 paws.